Welcome to Talking Kootenay Books. I am your host, Jim Cameron, filling in for Keith Powell, your regular host, who is here today in the author's chair due to the recent publication of his book, In the Shadow of Elephants. Keith, pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks, Jim. Great
different.
to be here.
Yeah, a little different for you sitting on that
I was always
side.
wondering what I was like on the guest chair.
Well, it's a good place to be. A very good place to be. And this is your fourth book?
Fourth book, yes. It's In the Shadow of the Elephants, as you mentioned. And so the first book came out in 2009.
Right.
And then the second book, 2011, and third book in 2014. So we had Living in the Shadow of Fisher Peak as the first one,
Right.
Raising Cain as the second one, and then Fisher Peak Chronicles as the third one, and now this is the fourth.
Right, and all really dealing with our local history, and in this case, for sure, a historical novel, which by definition is both historically accurate and also fictional.
I've tried to really add a story element to the book. So, in other words, people always give me feedback that they may not necessarily like history, but they enjoy the story that goes with it. And what I've really tried to do is put that story in throughout the entire book, and it sort of carries it through from beginning to end.
Yeah, it sure does. And in this case, a really fascinating journey. This book covers, well, over 70 years, really, of not just local history, not just the East and West Kootenays, but it takes us to Stillwater, Minnesota. We go as far as Tokyo.
Yes.
And all due, really, I think, to your main character, a fellow who would normally, I think, be just a footnote in the sports pages of our local papers here, but really quite a unique fellow by the name of Jimmy Peaver.
Yeah, Jimmy Peaver is the main character of the book, and he has an interesting story, that's for sure. And what I've tried to highlight is the fact that here's this young hockey player from a team called the Kimberley Intermediates, and they were one of the pioneering teams in the Kootenays, and they went on to win the Koi Cup, which was emblematic of BC Championship. And I try and weave his story into a lot of historical events that happened throughout the Kootenays.
Yeah, just speaking of the Koi Cup, that's a trophy that's still presented today, isn't it? The senior AA, I think.
That's right, yes.
I saw that, starting from the 1920s, which is really where we first come into contact with Jimmy and some of his friends. Now the very unique thing about Jimmy Peaver, of course, is he's more than just your regular athlete. He, in fact, is quite a unique one-armed athlete, and more than that, a goaltender in hockey and a baseball player.
That's what captivated me about it. That character is when I first discovered him a number of years ago, I just thought, wow, what an interesting guy. In fact, when he skated onto the ice when they were playing the Koi Cup, the Vancouver Seaforce, which was the team they were competing against, who were the favorites, basically laughed the team off the ice because they said, one-armed goalie? I mean, this is going to be a walk in the park. So he was able to overcome that, and I really try and develop a story around his character.
Yeah, fascinating fellow, and you've got a really nice story considering, there's parts of, and this is the fictional part, there's parts of Jimmy Peaver's life that are really a mystery. Mm-hmm. He existed here in the Kootenays and then disappeared in some regards. So you've filled in a whole lot of interesting detail with
Well, you
Jimmy.
have to remember, it's a lot of imagination,
Sure.
a lot of fiction in there. But what I've taken is all the facts that I could find. So his story, I think there were 28 or 29 references in the historical record to Peaver. And then all of a sudden he just disappears.
Yeah.
And I've tried to trace him down and done all kinds of research and was never able to do that. And so it got me thinking, there's a story here, let's tell it and let's add a fictional element to it and turn it into a story about the Kootenays.
So let's talk a little about the year 1926, which is a pivotal year in the novel.
Yeah.
And also a pivotal year in much of Cranbrook's history. I think due in at least some large part to the what became known as the Great Elephant Hunt.
That's right. 1926 was a pivotal year, as you mentioned, in the fact that a lot of things sort of seemed to happen in that year, including Peaver winning the Koi Cup and the elephants escaping. Now, it's hard to grasp today how big that story was back in 1926. if you go back and look at the historical references, and I've got a lot of them in the book, literally hundreds and hundreds of newspapers around the globe were covering this event, and they were all fascinated by the fact that 13 elephants were wandering the Rocky Mountains, and how were they going to catch them. In fact, the call went out to all the great elephant handlers, and one flew up here, his plane crashed on the way, and it was a story of drama and so forth, and it took a good 6 to 8 weeks before they actually caught the last, rounded up the last elephant. So, I just thought that sort of event was certainly noteworthy, and tying it in with Peever's life and the fact that he won the hockey championship at that time was also sort of part of the story.
You have a number of excellent photographs of baseball teams in the area, including Lumberton and various others. I was wondering, as you mentioned with the elephants, one of the fellows that we brought here to help find our escaped pachyderms was a fellow by the name of Frank Cheerful Gardner.
Yeah, I did a bit of research on Gardner, and I get the impression that he wasn't so cheerful.
I don't think he was.
I'm not sure where he got that nickname from, but he had this sort of inevitable job of having to round up all these elephants and keep track of them all the time. You can just imagine the guy was just frustrated or stressed out all the time because they were escaping and they were causing problems and whatever. But they did end up flying him up here. As I mentioned, the plane crashed. Then he got here by train and sort of spearheaded the hunt for the remaining elephants. And he was known as sort of the best elephant trainer in North America.
Right. And in fact, we did locate all the elephants one way or another, including Cranbrook Ed, who was previously Charlie Ed. And you carry on with Cranbrook Ed's life in the circus, and I won't spoil the ending. Quite an interesting ending that a lot of people aren't aware of for Cranbrook Ed. Gardner is only one of many historical figures of significance that you include in your book. Locally, we have people like Dr. Frank Green, for whom the Green Home is named. Really quite a visionary in his own way, one of the first doctors in town here. He took over the hospital in town from the hospital that used to be at St. Eugene Mission, right. Which was, the mission was created not in small part due to a fellow by the name of Father Nicholas Coppola.
Right, yeah.
One of the Jesuit missionaries in the area, and who had an awful lot to do with the Moye mine. Right.
Yeah, no, they were all sort of interconnected, because you have to remember, this was sort of the era of industrial development within the Kootenays, and it goes back to the early days of mining and forestry. One of the notable characters was Otis Staples, who had the huge mill out at Wycliffe. And one of the ways he kept his employees happy is they played baseball in the summer and hockey in the winter. And Wycliffe was known as a powerhouse when it came to sports teams.
Well, you're exactly right there. Many of the small communities here had really serious ball players. And right. In fact, they would bring in some pretty good ringers to work in the mill and give them time off whenever a game had to be played. It was quite an important part of the of each community to have a good ball team. Speaking of mining, I think a lot of people nowadays in Cranbrook are unaware of how much mining played in Cranbrook's history. And in speaking of Moye mining, we could touch on a fellow who appears quite regularly in the book by the name of Selwyn Blaylock.
Right. Blaylock was a major force. He was sort of what I would call the region's first industrialist. He got consolidated mining and smelting going and
right.
brought all the mines together. He played an integral part in making sure that the industry of mining survived and thrived in the Kootenays, and the foundation that we have, that he built, we still have today.
Yeah, it's really quite an important part of our history. You talk about Peter Verrigan, one of the leaders of the Doukhobors, and in fact you discuss the Sons of Freedom, the more active and mischievous, to say the least, sect of the Doukhobors. You talk about Project P9, is it?
P9, yes.
Yeah, which is really an interesting part of trails history and,
Right.
and the West Kootenay.
Again, a lot of people may not know that, but you know, back in the early days, the war years, Cominco was commissioned to produce heavy water, and they had this 9-story tower right in the middle of Warfield, and most of the residents would walk by it every day, but very few of them talked about it. And what I try and do is just devote a chapter or two to that history. And so what it does is give me an opportunity to go around the Kootenays and really just talk about major events that happen and the significance that they have to our region.
I think I can say with complete certainty that the readers of this book are going to find it I think, a fascinating journey. I certainly did.
Okay.
And as you said, Keith, it's so nice to see some of the history come alive. And I understand that you fill that out fictionally, but you do it in such a nice manner that I feel like I actually know Jimmy Peaver pretty well.
Yeah.
I know his buddy Tiny Thompson, who was born in Sandon and went on to win 4 Vezina Cups as a goaltender with Boston.
Yeah, he was the first individual from the Kootenays that went into the NHL Hockey Hall of Fame. So.
Yeah, and really a point of pride too, like much of it. It's a fascinating read. It's got plenty of action, lots of historical details, some great photos. It's a perfect complement to your ever-growing library of authored books.
Well, thank you, Jim. I hope people enjoy reading it.
Well, I'm sure they will. And it's been a pleasure talking with you today.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Jim Cameron for Talking Kootenay Books.
My name is Keith Powell. I'm the host of Talking Kootenay Books, and my guest today is Terry Gaynor. Terry is an author from Nelson. Great to have you on the show, Terry. You and I go back a ways. We were on the Kootenay Rockies board for a number of years. What was it, 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, it was in the late 90s, early 2000s, probably about 3 years, that's correct. Yeah.
So people would recognize you from all your involvement in the tourism industry here in the Kootenays. Give us a little bit of background to some of that history.
Well, I was born in a tourist town, town of Banff, raised there, and I think it's been in my blood ever since.
Right.
But for years I was VP marketing and sales at Brewster's. Then I had a stint at the Rocky Mountaineer in a similar position.
Right.
And I ended up my career helping to organize a startup railroad in Montana called Montana Rockies Rail Tours.
Right.
That operated between Spokane and Yellowstone National Park.
Right. And you had your own bus line for a while, or you?
I did. I was involved with a partner in Dudney Coach Lines, which was based on a trail.
Right. And the inspiration of your new book, and congratulations, it's most fascinating, entitled When Trains Ruled the Rockies. So tell me the significance of that title.
We moved to Banff, our family, in 1948, and it was probably the first home that I remember,
right.
the train station, because my dad's position as station agent meant that we had a residence on top of the station.
So you lived right there?
We lived right on top of the station, yeah.
Okay.
And at a very young age, up until I was about 14, that's the first home that I vividly remember.
Right.
So back in about 2014, I was going through Banff, and I'd heard that they were doing a renovation on the station, which had been, frankly, falling apart for many years. Mm-hmm. And I went back and had a look at it, and while I was there, I met the foreman who was in charge of the construction.
Okay.
And we went through there, and I thought they were doing a pretty good job of it. Mm-hmm. In fact, they did an excellent job of the renovations, but when I left there, I had kind of an empty, sort of a hollow feeling, because there was no story about the station, nice pictures and things like that. Mm-hmm. But at one time, the CPR station, aside from being my home,
right.
Was the hub of Banff. I mean, of everything that happened in that national park. So the people, the merchandise, the food, everything came through that station.
So let's just explore that for a moment. So here's Banff, sort of in the middle of nowhere in the Canadian Rockies, and the access point is the train station.
Absolutely. It was, the express office was the UPS and the FedEx of the day.
Yeah.
All the heavier freight came in through the freight shed, the freight department.
Right.
At the height of it, when I was a young fella, We had 5 trains east and 5 west every single day in the summer. And year round there was 4 of them, and they were transcontinental trains.
Right.
And the unique train, I thought, was the one that came out of Chicago and Minneapolis. It was called the Mountaineer, and it was a summer tour train.
Right.
It operated mirroring the season of the Banff Springs Hotel,
I see.
which opened up every year in long weekend in May and closed shortly after Labor Day.
So literally it would bring hundreds of visitors to the area?
It did, and it brought largely most of the tour operators that operated out of the U.S., out of the eastern part of the U.S., yes.
Right. Okay, so you were a young lad exploring the train station, but you ended up working there as well, did you not?
Right. When I was old enough to go to work for CP, you had to be 15 or maybe 16, and I lied about my age, I'm not sure which. But I got a job in the baggage room, first of all, and then I got my ultimate dream job in those days, which was to be a red cap, because that's where the money was. Big tips loading those carts full of luggage onto the train for the passengers, and it was a wonderful way to spend the early part of my life, yeah.
So do you feel that that experience really set the foundation for the rest of your career in tourism?
Absolutely, yeah.
How so?
Well, you know, I knew what I really wanted to do was work for the railroad.
Yeah.
But my dad, he sat me down one day and he said, look, all these passenger trains are going to go away. He saw it coming.
Yeah.
And he said, I think you should go to university. And in those days, there was no like tourism courses or anything. And I knew I wanted to be involved, if not with the railroad, at least in tourism or something like that.
Right.
And I spent a year at university, and it was a relative disaster. I became an excellent bridge player.
Yeah.
And not much else.
Yeah. Well, you learned something. So let's just talk about the inspiration of the book. So how did you actually go about putting it on paper? How long did it take you? And how did that all go?
Well, it was not easy at first. I after visiting the station and thinking that somebody should write the story of what used to happen there.
Right.
I was talking to my daughter and I said, gee, I wish there was a book about that. And she kind of looked at me and she said, well, you live there, you work there. Why don't you write it?
Right.
And I thought, well, that would be a nice challenge, but I've never written anything in my life, you know.
Right.
But she pushed me, and one day I sat down and thought, I better give this a go.
Right. So how long did that take you to actually, from concept to finish?
About 3.5 years.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you've been working on it a bit, and understand Rocky Mountain Books, are they out of Calgary?
Victoria.
Victoria now. They have published it for you. How was that experience?
Well, that was interesting because I did hire a professional editor, a gal by the name of Joan Dixon, who took all my pages of hieroglyphics and managed to make it into a manuscript that was apparently acceptable to Rocky Mountain Books.
Okay.
I submitted it to them because I thought it fit the genre of what they do publish.
Yeah.
You know, stuff about the Rocky Mountains and
Yes, of course.
adventures and all that. And you know, I wasn't kidding myself. I was convinced I'd end up self-publishing because it was the first time I'd ever tried it. And so when my book was accepted for publication, I was over the moon.
Yes, I can imagine.
Yeah.
You know, one thing that really stood out for me in the book is page after page of sort of classic historical photos. How did that all come about?
Well, you know, when I started writing, I knew I needed to have photos because I thought that the photos would obviously more than supplement the copy, because I thought if they just sit there and read a book.
Right.
But I got most of the photos came from archives. The White Museum in Banff,
Yes.
archives of the Canadian Rockies.
Yeah.
Amazing facility,
Yes.
and the most amazing staff in the world.
Right.
Similarly, the provincial archives in Edmonton. I had a few visits there, and between the two of them, it was absolutely amazing the help I got and the historic photographs, railroad photographs,
Right.
that are available. The trouble is trying to find the ones you want.
Right.
Because I didn't really know where to look, you know.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you've done a good job, and I'm sure your publisher probably helped out a little bit there, but it really does set a nice tone for your book. I just wanted to ask you, Terry, looking back on your years of experience in the tourism business, starting in Banff, into the Kootenays, how have you seen it change? Time of the train, Now we have basically the automobile and airplane. That's our mode of transportation. How do you think that's changed as far as the national parks go?
It's changed the entire dynamic of Banff and the national parks for sure.
Yeah.
You know, the last successful summer, I guess you'd call it, or at least that's what I called it, of train travel was the summer of 1962, which also happened to be the year of the Seattle World's Fair.
Okay.
So all of the tour operators in North America and perhaps the world were putting together packages for the World's Fair and tacking them on to the end of a lot of Canadian Rockies programs, because the Rockies had always been the icon, you know.
Yes. Yeah.
So that Mountaineer train out of Chicago, for instance, out of Minneapolis, St. Paul, that summer was the biggest summer it ever had, but ironically, it was the last summer it ever operated.
Why was that?
Trans-Canada Highway.
Okay.
The Trans-Canada Highway opened up in August of 1962.
Yeah.
And on opening day, 700 Airstream trailers and 3,000 cars passed over the Rogers Pass, which was the last link and opening of the highway.
Right.
That was also sort of the entry of the tour buses into the tourism business. And CP saw it coming, and they stopped the operation of the Mountaineer the following year.
Right.
They did have a connection from Minneapolis up to Winnipeg, and then they would put through cars, as they called them, on the Dominion that came from Winnipeg through to Banff. But that was the beginning of the end for rail travel to the Rockies.
Right.
So what happened since then? Well, suddenly you had this access to the national parks.
Yeah.
And I think last year about 6 million cars went through the national park, which has changed the whole
Dynamic.
the whole operation. Motels and hotels have been built, and it's not like it used to be. Yeah.
No. But you do capture that era, and you know, there has been a resurgence in the interest as far as train travel and so forth. We've got the Rocky Mountaineer that goes into Banff and area. How does that compare, do you think, to what you're talking about when it was a regular scheduled daily occurrence?
Well, you know, we had all these different passenger trains, and they were different. We had trains 1 and 2 that they used to call the Stop Everywhere train.
Okay.
And they had sleeping cars, they had dining cars, but they also were the mail and express cars. The whole head end of the train, about anywhere from 7 to 10 cars, would be reefers full of perishables, because those trains went faster than the freight trains.
Yeah.
And then you had the mail cars, and then you would have the passenger cars. And because of the mail, and they stopped everywhere, it was a longer transcontinental journey. And the people who traveled on that train were people going from community to community or going to see friends. Right. Obviously, it wasn't a tourist train, because they were the only 2 trains that went through the Rockies in the night. Right. Because they were business connections to Vancouver out of Calgary.
So more of a commercial train.
It really was a commercial train, yeah. Then the Dominion, which was in those days, it was the crack train across Canada until they came up with the Canadian in the mid-50s.
Right. So all the stories and accounts that you have in the book, any favorites that stand out?
Oh, you know, when the Canadian was introduced by CP in 1955, they were glorious stainless steel cars and all that with domes, and it was the most luxurious train in the world at that time. But my heart was with the Mountaineer, that train that was a 2-nation train. It came out of the States, and there was just some mystique about it that caught my eye.
Yeah, I can hear what you're saying. You know, even today you can go and stand on a train station platform, and there's a sense of excitement when the train arrives.
There is.
And I think that's sort of the essence that you've caught in the book. So the book is When Trains Ruled the Rockies. Terry Gaynor is our author today. Thanks, Terry. I really appreciate your insight and taking the time to talk to us about your new book.
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
My name is Keith Powell, and this has been Talking Kootenay Books.